Hi again, welcome to another session of Information Security Assurance and Management. Previously, we had covered the analytical part, which involved the quantitative and qualitative analysis before a certain project or the next step to choose the correct security control can be made. Now, after all the risks and threat for all those assets that you want to protect has been considered, now is actually the time to implement the project. So for chapter 5, we are going to look at the information security implementation. Now going back to this diagram, we have covered pretty much on the investigation, analysis, and the requirement parts for any security control to be considered. Now is the implementation part. So basically, implementation includes changes to existing procedures, the people, hardware, and also software and data that we are handling with regard to the asset that you want to protect. And basically, for this part, we are going to consider how do we exactly going to implement the new changes that we want into our organization in order to protect the asset that we have identified. The most important aspect before we can begin project development and implementation is, of course, to get the green light from the management. Okay, consider that perhaps you have presented your ideas and you have presented the proper analytic requirement. So we assume that at this point, the management has already agreed to green light whatever you want to implement and perhaps want to buy for the new security control. Now, the major steps in executing the project will have to be on planning the actual project, supervising the tasks and the action steps needed, and also lastly, wrapping up. So in a nutshell, planning includes whatever you want to buy, how are you going to buy it, who will be involved, who will be overseeing the project, and secondly, the supervising tasks. You identify your team, you identify which manpower will go to what task. For example, in terms of planning, in terms of financing, in terms of implementing, and also in terms of monitoring the project once it is executed. And for the third phase is wrapping up. It's basically for you to get feedbacks from whatever the implementation and execution that you have done. And then perhaps if there is any improvement needed, you will need to report it and present it later on during the perhaps the reflection, or perhaps if you want to consider an extension or improvement for whatever you have executed. In order to plan, each organization usually have their own methodology that they want to actually implement it. So, but basically the main core of the planning and methodology in the management of project will have this basic core, which is planning, the supervision of tasks, and the wrapping up of tasks throughout the execution and implementation of project. Of course, in planning for a major project, especially in security, it is not an easy task. You need, first of all, to identify who will be on your side throughout the project development. So this is why during the planning stage, you scrutinize each and every activities that will be involved in the project implementation. So for example, the task can be described in the work breakdown structure. So basically in a work background structure, you have the title of the project, what is the project all about, that describes the overall activities or the security control that you want to implement for the project. So perhaps the project name is a security control and procedures and policy for the database management system, for example. So under that task or project, you have the activity title. Okay, so these are the works that need to be accomplished that contributes to the main project. So it can be perhaps user identification, it can be on policy development, it can be also on policy monitoring, it can be on security implementation. You identify with your team, because by this point you must already identify who will be involved with the project and what is their expertise. And for each of those tasks, who will be the supervisor for all those tasks, or who will be the person in charge. Okay, so basically the work breakdown structure, or the WBS, have this thing to consider or to be put into the structure. So first of all, what are the work to be accomplished? These are the activities. And then who will be the person in charge, and under each of those person in charge, perhaps they have to identify by themselves, because when you are picking the person for to be the person in charge, they must be highly skilled or perhaps have previous experience on the task. So the start and end date that you expect, okay, for example, if you're in FYP that you are very familiar, this perhaps can be described from the Gantt chart: the start date, the end date, and what are the activities that will be involved that could contribute to the main activity. And then the amount and effort required. So basically, what are the tasks under that sub-activity? So perhaps for data collection, you need to perform an interview. You need to identify how are you going to collect the data. Okay, who is going to verify the data, for example. So you identify the activities and the amount of effort. So for that task, how many months or perhaps how many days will be needed to complete the task? This is very important because each of those tasks needs to be monitored so that the amount of effort is constantly on time. And then there's estimated capital and non-capital expenses. Non-capital, of course, in terms of monetary needs, and non-capital sometimes involve the time management. And then lastly, the identification of dependency between those tasks. So perhaps the data collection, if you don't have enough data, you cannot proceed to the next activity, for example. Or if you don't have proper person identification, then perhaps the next task also will be affected from the previous one. So you need to identify dependencies between the activities, and also activities that can stand alone and can be done in parallel. This is very important in a work breakdown structure, because in a work breakdown structure, you identify the person involved, identify which team or which unit will need to work together, and which team can actually do tasks in parallel. Means that he or she will not rely on other person's result, and it can proceed uh, at the same time as other activities. Okay, so basically for this part, you identify the task, you break down the task into the person in charge, the amount of effort needed, and how are you going to actually monitor those tasks, make sure that it is on time. This is very important during the planning stage. So apart from other considerations, which include financial, priority of activities, the time and scheduling of activities, and also in terms of staff and procurement, other consideration for or during the project planning is including the organization feasibility. It means that does your organization have the feasibility in terms of the proper staff or the proper manpower, in terms of having a proper monetary or financial capability to support that activity. Of course, this is needed even before the project has begun, but sometimes this is easily overlooked if, let's say, the management does not scrutinize during your proposal stage. So you yourself, as the project manager, must consider this even before the project has gotten the green light, because it's very important to know your organization standpoint in terms of this feasibility of executing and supporting the project. Because if you discover all this consideration or requirement very late into the project, then your project might be problematic in the long run. Hence, from the very beginning, the selection for a very good project manager is very important. Okay, although you will be from the very start in terms of getting the proper analytical requirement, identifying the needs of the security control, but sometimes you need to transfer that responsibility to a very capable project manager. So it does not necessarily means it will be you managing the project. Sometimes you need to get together with your team again and select the most appropriate and suitable candidate to manage the project. This includes the tasks of the project manager, which is on the integration management, the scope management, time and cost management, quality management, also the human resource management, stakeholder management, risk management, and supplier management. Although from those tasks of the role of the project manager, sometimes it cannot be done, and most of the time it cannot be done by one single individual only. So that's why usually you have the main project manager, which is usually your chief information security manager, and then under his wing you have other task manager, which also responsible for those smaller activities that you have identified earlier. So working together, you must make sure that all these smaller tasks and management needs to be handled by a very capable person, and not because you just know that person or that person is your friend, but the one that you selected as the manager for that task is the one that is very capable to handle the task. If not, the project could be jeopardized and perhaps will not be successful as you intended to be. Also, in a separate scenario, sometimes you need to have one champion from other organization, and usually this champion comes from the one that is actually financing the project. For example, in Unit 10, usually we have projects that comes from the TNB or perhaps other organization. So these project champions are assigned by the governing organization to oversee whatever we have to actually develop. So for example, the project from TNB, it has the champion from TNB, and the champion from TNB will oversee the activities that are being done by the researcher from Unit 10. So the task is divided from the one that is financing the project to the one that is executing the project. This can also happen. So this is actually an alternative to a very traditional approach where only your organization manages the project without any involvement from other parties. After you have properly assembled the team, properly assembled the timeline for the project, identified the activities, now it's time to make sure that whatever you are executing is according to the framework that you have previously planned for. So you need to always measure the progress periodically. Perhaps once a month, look at the progress, or perhaps is the project is based on perhaps 2 to 3 years time frame, you need to consider the appropriate timeline to actually keep track of the progress. It's always good to hold a meeting of progress with the manager of each of the tasks that you have identified before. This is to ensure that you can take corrective measure if, let's say, certain delays happens in certain activities or department regarding the project implementation. So anything that will involve the activity success must be reviewed. So you need to actually oversee the spending of the money, the scheduling impact. Let's say it needs to be moved to a certain date. What will happen in the long run if that activities actually rely on other activities in your project execution? So you must ensure that there is proper quality and quantity survey, and also progress is actually collected so that you can see the overall progress and the execution of the project will be successful until the end. So in a simple flowchart, usually you have developed the plan, you actually do the work and implementation, oversee the progress, is it the task complete or not? Okay, if yes, okay. If it's not, is it on target, or is there any problem involved with the progress of that particular task? So you must take corrective measure and then continue the work until you have finished the task for that project. Some things that you need to also consider during the implementation is, of course, you are dealing with technology. And when it involves technology, it does not only necessarily means that you must only consider the software and hardware problems, because the one that is using that technology is, of course, human. And as human, it comes with many sometimes unforeseen circumstances and problems, because we cannot expect people to be the same as what we expect them to actually behave. That's why it's very important during or before the project actually begins, you must identify the target group that will be using the security control and identify how your security control can easily be adapted into their working behavior or perhaps their technical requirement before using certain security implementation or new technology to protect your asset. Which is why during the implementation, there must be a sort of conversion strategies to ensure that whatever new technology or new software that you want to introduce to the people that is actually doing business with the asset have a very proper conversion stage that you are considering. So the first four basic approach are the direct changeover. It means that after you have properly identified this target group, so they are suitable for a very direct changeover. This is usually if the target group that you identify is very well adapted with technology and has always been fully or directly related to the use of technology, such as the technical people, the technician, or perhaps the IT management department. So they are very secure with using whatever new software or new hardware that you might introduce, and perhaps the conversion scenario will not be very hard. It's just perhaps a change of version, and the use of the new software is very similar. It's just that you are changing a new version and with similar feature but perhaps improved performance. Secondly is the phase implementation. So the phase implementation, if let's say there need to be a gradual changes in terms of perhaps the hardware and software version that you are using, and also in terms of new policy that you want to introduce. So it must be done gradually and see stages by stages the changes that you introduce from the new security control can be accepted in stages. Perhaps during the first part is introduction of the policy. Secondly is doing the awareness program, and perhaps the third is for the training and actual use of the new security control or policy. The most important thing is you gradually introduce the change and not introduce it abruptly to expect an overnight change. Okay, third is you have a pilot implementation. So in this approach, you have one implementation at one separate site, or perhaps you have a separate type of user there that is very well adapted to change and see how the new implementation fares in that particular location or group. And then after the implementation is successful in that location, then you try to introduce it to other separate location. The fourth is parallel operation. So in this implementation, you see the introduction of new technology or new security control in a separate location, but perhaps with separate target group. So you see how does each of these location fares against the new implementation. This is usually important if you have a very diverse organization that is located in a multiple location. So you want to see whether a geographical factor, geograph geographical factor plays a role in the implementation, or perhaps the technology differences. One location is very high tech, perhaps another location is perhaps a much more medium setting. So you want to see the implementation in different settings and environment. So whatever the case, you must consider this approach based on the capability of your organization and also the capability of the people and target user that will be using this new security control in the long run. Okay, properly identifying the target user, of course, is very important even from the planning and project requirement stage. to ensure that you successfully do and introduce the changes to protect your asset. Also, in implementation of a new security control, there are the bullseye method. So basically, there are 4 layers in this method. It relies on the process of evaluating the project plans in progression through the 4 layers. Okay, the inner layers is the actual implementation, and the outer layer is the system, network, and the policies. So this is usually very important if you want to gradually introduce new changes to your security control that protect the asset. And usually it begins from the very basic policies that you have. Does your existing policy actually governs the new security control? If it does not, perhaps there are certain changes to the policy or improvement on the policy. After that, look at the network capabilities and the system's capability if you have new software and hardware to support your security control. And lastly is the actual application that will be used by the user that is also dealing with the asset. So sometimes it's enough just to change the policy because the policy needs further understanding and perhaps enforcement. And also this method of bullseye is very important if you want to improve existing security methodology, perhaps finding out the fault in existing implementation and find whether you can fix just the policy without actually affecting the network, system, and application. So you gradually move inwards as you try to find out what is the proper solution for the new security control that you want to introduce. Sometimes also the problem is you don't have enough technical staff to carry out the technical responsibility in terms of doing a new coding, a new script, or a new software or hardware implementation. That's why you need to decide whether during the implementation or even during the budgeting, if you want to outsource or not in this shortage of manpower or certain skill sets required to carry out the project execution. So usually it is advisable if you want to actually outsource, you hire the best possible outsource specialist, because as long as you are doing outsourcing, make sure you get the very best. If not, perhaps you can just consider training your existing manpower to carry out the task. And then retain the best attorneys possible to negotiate and verify legal and technical intricacies. Because sometimes when you are bringing outside organization or individual, there must be a proper way to have agreement. Sometimes you have to properly address the NDA, what is actually need to be private, what can be shared, also in terms of their entry into your organization. So this needs to be ironed out before you bring in outside party into your project. Also, in terms of managing the project and managing the change with the project, because you are actually introducing new things into your organization in terms of how things are done through policies, or perhaps how people are usually accustomed to existing software and hardware. So there must be a proper technology governance and change control. So this is where perhaps you can bring someone in HR or people management, because you need to have a proper governance in terms of this category, because you are actually trying to merge people, technology, and process together. So a very good change management must be there to guide the change and perhaps the uh, changing between whatever has been done previously to what you expect people are doing now to safeguard your asset. So you must have a proper process of change by having a proper management in the process. So you must try to improve communication, make sure people understand why this needs to be done, okay, how it needs to be done. Remember, if you are actually dealing with people, a gradual change must be there. You cannot just expect an overnight change to have one scenario into another scenario that you want overnight. And then try to enhance coordination between this policy and also whatever changes that you expect. Okay, you properly coordinate with your team. Okay, this team manages the people, this team manages the software implementation, and perhaps another team will cater for the hardware implementation. Have proper consideration during the planning of the project, and also update the progress, okay, accordingly. And then try to reduce unintended consequences. Try to expect problem before it happens. Okay, because in change management, you are actually doing change, and in doing so, you must expect some sort of perhaps a problem in doing the changes. And try to improve the quality of service. When people don't understand what is needed and what is required of them, you must communicate properly. There must be a channel where people can channel their perhaps inquiry, or perhaps if they don't understand how to do things according to what you expect them to be, you must properly have a proper channel with proper staffing to actually answer their query. And then ensure the groups are complying with policies, because you are actually trying to implement new policies and new procedures, so you must have proper way to monitor these changes even from your own team, because it isn't enough you want people to follow this new security control or security guideline, but if your team yourself doesn't actually follow the newly planned security policies. So this is very important because you are managing changes, and most probably changes will involve people. So you are trying to merge people, technology, and process together during the implementation. So when we talk about the people there, this is the non-technical aspect of implementation, because you have the software and hardware. Those are very technical requirement. Usually the most hardest part is having your people on board with the change, because this is actually related to how things are done. Some people are so accustomed to what has been done previously, they are very comfortable with how things have traditionally been done. So this is usually you need to manage from the very beginning, okay, which group will be most resistant to changes, and try to identify certain strategies to cater for that group during the change from old ways to the new ways to secure your asset. So as long as you want to introduce certain changes, you must expect certain resistance will always come to the change, because people are accustomed to what things have done previously. Sometimes it's very hard, usually for seniors people, or perhaps for people that has been in the organization for a very long time and very accustomed to how things are done previously. So which is why you must consider this Lewin change model, which is unfreezing. Prepare the employees for change from the very beginning. So that's why sometimes just present to them the policies first, and the guideline and proper procedures to the new policies that you want to implement. And after that, when you properly do the interview and present the policy, you identify and communicate with them whether they understand the policy or not before introducing the new security control. And then try to do the changes after the previous stage has been done, which is the unfreezing stage. Do the change and try to refreeze. This is to ensure the change becomes permanent. Means that whatever new things that you want to introduce, make it a habit. And also monitor the new policies implementation that you have introduced by perhaps giving reward or perhaps warning if those security control is not being followed. This has been covered even in the earlier chapter of our topic. Okay, so remember to unfreeze, change, and refreeze again to ensure whatever new policy that you want to introduce is or has become a habit to the people in your organization. That's why it's very important to ensure that the people that will be involved in the change is very open to the change in the first place. That's why the very first thing that you need to have from the very beginning of the planning process is the identification of the target group, and then perhaps doing some interview and see what the problems and how they are actually doing things normally with regard to the asset that you want to protect. See certain policies that you can improve or perhaps fix without affecting the way they are doing things. This can make them more open to the changes because you are actually involving them from the very beginning of the process. And then you must develop a culture that supports change. The culture that supports change is because you actually always communicating with your people. Okay, make sure you understand your people and your people understand why certain things need to change or need to be improved. The communication here is the key. So without communication, people will be very resilient to change because they do not understand why certain things need to change, why certain things need to be improving. So the key in change management is actually communicating with the people that will be doing the changes or be affected by the change. So I stress again, the very first step is to communicate with the people that will be involved in the change. Identify the target group. Okay, perhaps there is selected group, non-technical people, technical people, perhaps just people coming in and out of the organization. So identify how they do things and try to communicate with them what method are they comfortable with if, let's say, a new security control or policies need to be instilled in the organization. So the key is always to improve interaction and communication. So the three-step process for project managers is to communicate, educate, and involve the very individual or group that will be affected by the change that you want to introduce. Secondly, in developing a culture that supports change is again to involve the people. So you must actually try to prevent resilience from happening by constantly communicating and perhaps rewarding if certain initiative has been supported or being done by your people. So you must develop a culture in your organization in order to have a certain benchmark into activities that actually reward when people are actually doing things for the better and perhaps exchange of ideas. If let's say the target group themselves have certain ideas what things that can be done to improve and to secure your information asset. That is why the very important activities before any project is executed is identify the target group, communicate and identify their needs so that there will be no resilience or resistance when you want to implement new things. Get your people involved, communicate, and perhaps reward them if things are going your way as planned. Now, after the project is done, it's time for a project wrap-up. The important activities in the project wrap-up is to ensure that all other progress has been collected, documented, and is kept in a safe place to be reviewed later on, perhaps in future, or if you have new project to actually take up. This documentation in the project wrap-up can also be used as your project repertoire that can be used to make sure that it can justify. Let's say you have another task coming up, then the progress that you have done in this project can be a benchmark for other activities that will be coming or given to your team. So this can be a very good resume for your project and could justify why your project team can be picked for the next task that will be given by the organization based on the experience on that project that you have finished. So the activities that will involve is of course the collect of documentation, the finalized status report, the final report, and the presentation wrap up to the management to actually report what you have done towards the implementation of the security control is perhaps successful. And also, it's very important to resolve any pending issues, and if there are any issues, identify what will be the cause and what will be the corrective measure to fix or improve the task that is perhaps problematic or causing a certain hiccup to your project progress. And then lastly, draw conclusion about how to improve the overall process even if your project successfully finished on time. This can be done, or this is good because it can be used as a guideline for any future undertakings of similar project or perhaps project from the same team. So in summary, before we move on to the next part is you need to understand the steps needed before you actually begin implementing your project. So you must properly plan the next phase of activities, which is the identification of the people that will be involved in the project, and then how to actually ensure that all the project activities is being monitored, recorded, and after that is well presented in the end. And also, the most important part is the change management, because you are actually managing people and you must identify the people that will be affected because they are the one that will be directly impacted when you introduce the new policies, software, or perhaps hardware to secure your information asset. The key here is communication. Okay, so I hope you can capture all these ideas and use whatever we have covered today in perhaps your practice later on. So I see you in the next session. Thank you. The most important factor aside from technical requirements is identifying the proper manpower and personnel for any security project and implementation. So in chapter 6, we are going to cover the issues of personnel, either your own workforce or perhaps if you want to involve other people in your project. For the first part, we are going to look at the staffing security function. This is very important, especially if you are a department that is constantly doing security tasks and also in terms of executing whatever new security policies and perhaps technical implementation needed for your organization. The task of having proper staffing for the security function is usually up to the CISO or perhaps the top level management in any organization. The challenge here is to actually find out which of the individuals that they actually interview or select for the role having a good mix of perhaps entry level technician, the medium level management, and also the top level management that can work together to solve a security problem or to provide a proper security solution. Secondly, they must understand that every role, what is their responsibility and how does they interact with each other. For the technician, the medium level management, and also the CISO, for example, what will be their role in actually providing the solution needed for the organization. And also, there is always a supply and demand in terms of cybersecurity roles. The most important or glaring problem in this field is that usually they have a problem of identifying which personnel to actually select and which skill sets to actually look for in this individual. Okay, currently, based on ISACA's Global State of Cybersecurity of 2020, these are the skills required for a person looking for information security position. First of all, they must have at least hands-on training in terms of cybersecurity skills. Secondly, of course, they must have their credentials from perhaps certification or perhaps a certified body. And then, of course, if possible for management position or medium level management, is the hands-on cybersecurity experience actually handling real-world problem and providing solution. Okay, so if you are a cybersecurity student, of course, you need to look out for these requirement or important factors when deciding or when proposing to be in the industry later on. In terms of skill gap that exists in information security professionals, this is what presented by the ASACA 2020 survey. So basically, the top 5 skill gap that exists in these security professionals are, first of all, in terms of soft skills, means in terms of communicating and actually relaying what they thought or think on paper or perhaps during presentation. And then the 30% is on IT knowledge and skill gap. This itself, if let's say the candidate themselves doesn't promote the skills that they have according to the needs of the organization. Others skill gap include insufficient business insight. This is usually important if you are actually going to present your argument in terms of business sense, or what does it mean in terms of financial gain and losses for the organization. So you must, as future security professionals, must be able to relate the importance of securing any information asset in terms of relating it to the financial uh, numbering to convince the management. And then, of course, insufficient hands-on training. This is a common problem in any new candidate. So that's why it is always advisable for you to get as much experience as you can, either during your industrial training or during your lab session and even during your final year project. This can significantly enhance your skills, and perhaps you can further describe those skills when you write your resume or CV. And then also the top growing cybersecurity skills, okay, that is projected for 2021 until 2025 is, of course, you must be able to have some application development security skills, cloud security, and also on understanding the risk management. Okay, for risk management is actually very high, about 60% need from the industry. Okay, so what you have learned from this subject, please use it and at least try to communicate and try to show that what you have learned in this subject is actually you understand what does it role in actually protecting the asset, and try to actually convey what you have understand from this subject so that it can easily reflect and also shine what you have from other candidates later on that can make you chosen as part of the information security team. The key factor here that you need to understand regarding the information security profession, there is always the challenge from the management themselves in order to find the correct candidate. This in terms of usually fresh technical manpower enter the field with very minimal experience, while many senior information security professionals usually applying for the management level or the CISO management level usually have experience in law enforcement and the military, but usually their experience in the IT field themselves is very minimal. And also, based on the same survey by ESECA of 2020, usually it takes 6 months or more to fill an open cybersecurity position with a qualified candidate. So just like we have covered before, we have understand that there is a demand for cybersecurity professionals, but in order to fill in this demand, okay, they usually have a lot of scrutinization or perhaps even the problem from the management themselves, okay, because 72% cybersecurity professionals believe that their HR department themselves does not regularly understand the needs. Because in terms of hiring, the HR department is the one that is doing the hiring, but sometimes they themselves didn't fully understand the requirement of a cybersecurity professionals. You can have an information system officer, but that information system officer cannot carry both information security and also information technology in one single department. Usually you have to have a specialist department or specialist individual that carry out the task for cybersecurity. The IT is on developing the system. The cybersecurity is on protecting the system. So this is how you need to promote yourself later on. What skills do you have that you can bring to the table for this such organization? That's why you need to understand when applying for a certain position, what are the skill set that they want, and try to highlight that skill either from what you have learned or which subject that you have learned before in university, and highlight one by one what you have learned from that subject that can be matching to the required skills needed by the organization. Okay, And usually, it is found that only 72% says that fewer than half of the cybersecurity applicants are well qualified. Okay, because sometimes people just because they take computer science, they also try to apply for cybersecurity position. Okay, so you must show where you are at an advantage, and perhaps what you have learned from pen testing, what you have learned in steganography, in information security management. Okay, try to highlight what you have learned. Okay, and try to show those skills through your CV and resume. The most important thing is you must be confident and try to show what you have learned here and what is your capability when applying for that such position. So in terms of an organization, usually these are the type of information security positions that is available. The first one are the definers. These are the management level staff. Usually, they don't have very much technical know-how, but they understand how does information security work and who are the responsible individual that can contribute to such role. Secondly, you have the builders and the support. Okay, these are the real techies who create and install the security solution. The support is of course the one that is using the administrator tool, the one that is providing technical support. So builders and support always work closely on the field. Okay, so you have the definers, the builders, and the support that constitute the role of information security position in any organization. And usually, it is also advisable if you don't mix the information technology department with the information security department. Usually, their role and jurisdiction are different. IT is on providing the system, information security is on protecting and securing whatever data that you wish to protect regarding to the organization. Of course, again, this depends on the financial capability of the organization. In terms of how does this position connect in an organization, here's an example of how it would look like. So on the top, you have the CISO, and sometimes, depending on the size of the organization, usually there will be a security consultant that will be advising the CISO. And below that, you have the security manager, usually with some technical know-how and certain experience in managing or even doing the technical work before he has been promoted into the security manager position. And under his wing, we have the security technician, the security administrator, and also the security officer. This is just a sample and it depends on the size of the organization. In the organization, the security technician is the one that is basically having the technical know-how on how to do things with regard to information security control and implementation, such as configuring firewalls, diagnosing and troubleshooting problem, and even coordinating with system and network administrator. Basically, if you want to get things done, the security technician is the one to do it. And this is basically an entry level position for any information security profession. After a while in the profession, usually security technician will be promoted to security manager. And as manager, he or she must be able to have the skills such as doing budgeting, project management, personnel management, and also hiring and firing the security technician that they want to hire. Basically, this requires certain experience on the field, and because of that, he or she usually know the technical skills that is needed to do things for any information security project. And this is basically a middle and lower level manager because he needs to report to the CISO and he needs to identify the enabler and the people that will be involved in the project. Usually, the suggestion from the technical manager and the security manager have certain weight that can be followed by the CISO, and this CISO will usually have the reports that is given by the security manager. And on top of that, we have the CISO. Usually, this is a very high-level management before reporting to the CIO of the company. So the role of the CISO is usually to communicate with top-level management and also to get the request from the CIO regarding what is the needs of the organization. And usually after getting whatever instruction from the top, the CISO will communicate to the security manager within whatever department that he or she might have in the organization. So depending on the size of the organization, usually under the CISO, there will be many departments, and also in this department, there will be separate security manager that will be managing separate issues regarding the information security problem or even solution. So these are just some of the examples of the CISO position around the world. You can look up the Seth McAllister, Sherry Maguire, Bradley, and also Tobias Gundrum. Okay, just for fun and even for exploration, try to find out the individuals that is the CISO in Malaysia. Okay, and try to understand what is their role in the organization which they are attached to. Now for part 2, we are going to look at the type of credentials required to be possessed by information security professional. One of the most important factors for hiring cybersecurity professional is his or she's credential. Basically, credentials are the skills that can be verified or vouched from certification, degree, or anything on paper that can be verified. Okay, for example, you can have a cybersecurity degree, or you can also have a certification in certain field of computer security. And basically, these are the top 3 determining factors to make sure that the candidate is qualified. First of all is the hands-on training, meaning that does the candidate have the technical skills to actually do the task in the cybersecurity problem and solution. And also the second one is the certified credential, either through the certification or even the professional degree. And lastly, of course, is the hands-on experience in cybersecurity. Okay, so usually many organizations rely on this on-paper credential to ensure that when hiring, it is easy for them to actually identify the type of skills that this individual might have regarding the requirement of their employment. But sometimes it's also hard for the organization themselves to identify which individual to hire because sometimes the human resource also are not very clear on the type of individual that they want. Because sometimes, okay, they want a two-in-one solution which has the information technology professional, and at the same time they want it packaged with cybersecurity professional. Okay, usually upon hiring, this currently is the top cybersecurity skills needed to be possessed by the candidate. So the candidate must have application development, security expertise or even experience, or even knowledge in cloud security, and also third is knowledge or skill on risk management. So basically, currently, these are the top growing cybersecurity skills in need. So it's up to you whether you can provide this skill or not. And also, it's up to the organization to understand whether this is basically the individual that they need. Okay, so if they don't know, perhaps it's up to you to convince them that they must hire you for that position. So highlight your skills in your CV and resume by extracting them from perhaps your industrial training, your course content, whatever activities that you have done in the course, and even your final year project. The most important thing is you try to match what is required from the industry to what skills that you have from your years of learning. So these are samples of certification body, okay, that usually people look up to for providing certain certification. So you can look up for CompTIA, ISE, ISACA, CISM, CISA, COVID, and so on. In Malaysia, you can also look at Global ACE, for example, and also cybersecurity themselves also providing certification. Okay, so as fresh graduate, so how can you actually highlight what skills you have from your perhaps cybersecurity degree? So these are some of the tips. Try to highlight your skills from the courses that you learn, such as programming and coding. Highlight your skills in that. Okay, highlight what you have done in this course. Okay, in terms of coursework, in terms of problem solving, or in terms of project given during the course. And also in application development, usually in debugging and testing during the application development, and also in terms of understanding the systems through operating system subject, for example, and also embedded system subject. Third is on networking knowledge. This can also, you can look up on your CCNA or perhaps networking courses. And of course, in risk management topic or subject. What have you learned in this subject that can you highlight perhaps in your CV and resume? Okay, the most important thing is for you, your own, to recognize whatever you have learned, identify them, and highlight them in your CV that can perhaps make future employer understand more that you are the person that they are looking for. The most pressing issue for any professional certification is of course the cost. And usually you will be sent for certification after you gain enough experience in the organization that you work for. Okay, this is also very important if let's say they want to promote you to perhaps a much more higher position, or perhaps they want you to gain much more skill from the work that you've done in certain department of cybersecurity. And also, even during study, sometimes there will be programs for students, okay, for you to gain those certification, sometimes for free, depending on the organizer. So always be on the lookout for what is being shared, and perhaps you can get the certification even before you graduate. So in terms of preparing yourself for any certification, of course, just like you are sitting down for an exam, you must have some sort of study guide from notes, even from your work experience, and also from training media, mentors and study partners, and of course, formal training program. Usually, you can sit for certification exam even without you do all those training, for example, just you read it on your own or perhaps based on your experience, and then you just go for the certification exam. Okay, this can also save from much more recurring courses because you are just paying for the exam and you go for the exam based on your own experience and your own self-study. So whichever approach that you might take, okay, just remember that the most important thing is that you need to actually promote the skills that you have, okay, in doing your work or perhaps getting a certain position in cybersecurity. So highlight what you are capable of from your CV aside from just certification. Okay, the most important thing is you are confident with yourself and the skills that you have. So usually, based on experience from our student, usually you can either start from the security analyst, the threat analyst, or the pen tester. This is usually very true for graduates from Unit 10. Okay, based on my interview with what we have from our graduate, these are the normal position being offered to our graduate. And after a while, usually we'll be going up, okay, either to junior management level, and after a while to senior management level. So it's up to you, okay, what do you do with those skills, and perhaps you can go back and look again about what you have learned in any of the subjects taken in our course. Okay, look up again and whether you still remember how to do those technical things, and also at the same time look at some of the management skills that you can bring forward and offer to your future employer. Okay, the most important thing is you understand what you are capable of and where are you going in this field. So before we move on further to the next part, you can take a 5-minute break and perhaps review what we have learned so far regarding the skill sets needed as information security professionals. Alright, so take a 5-minute break before we continue to the next part. In this part, we are going to look at the employment policies and practices. Basically, we are going to cover, let's say you are doing the hiring and even rehiring, for example, or even termination of certain position. So what must be done in terms of these issues? Because usually you are handling people. And of course, in handling people, there are many issues with regard to how they exit certain organization or how do you actually make certain exit or resignation a very pleasant and perhaps will not cause any future problems coming from that situation. So this is what this part is all about. The most important thing that's usually neglected by most organizations is they fail to actually integrate solid information security concept across all department and people in the organization. Okay, so even people, those employee is not actually related to computer security or information security, the concept or even the practice of safe computing, even safe information sharing must be embedded to all employee in the organization, because you don't want your people to actually accidentally leak certain information and perhaps recklessly using the perhaps email in your organization or perhaps bringing a foreign device in your organization, just and from that it can jeopardize the safety of your information asset that you want to actually protect. So it must be reflected upon your policy regarding the safeguard of your private information, even also how do people enter and exit from your organization. It must be embedded what is safe practice and what can or cannot be done within the compounds of your organization as long as they are the employee or even doing business with your organization. Okay, safety in information security must be understood by all the people within your organization. Let's begin from the hiring process. So, HR department must understand what can be shared even during the advertisement of the position that they want for the employee. Okay, do not overshare even during the advertisement of certain position or perhaps a certain description of job that is required from future employee. So you can perhaps describe, okay, you want this position, okay, but not overshare describing the access privilege that will be given to certain position or perhaps a specific office location where this employee, future employee will be placed. It's enough for you to have the requirement for the job. Let's say it requires certain computer security degree, for example, requires degree in management, okay, and then all of those information or whatever you want to request from the future candidate will be asked and shared during the interview perhaps or after the candidate has been successfully selected. The most important thing is to not overshare during the hiring process. You must be safe during the hiring process because upon during the interview process, the candidate is not yet your workforce. So be very sensible with what information that you are sharing, especially if you are actually doing the interview on site in your office location. So always have a guide, for example, to guide the candidate to the location of the interview. Do not let the candidate just wander around in your office building, okay, because this could be a very hazardous condition because they will know some type of location or perhaps specific location within your company, for example, that is very sensitive or have private document. So always have an escorting this candidate during the interview and after they exit the interview process. Also, try to limit all the information that you are sharing regarding the room information, for example, or regarding who is responsible for certain part in the building, for example, and also access privilege that will be given to the employee if they are actually hired. And also, when you are actually hiring new people, make sure you send this uh, employee to perhaps an awareness program or what you expect of them regarding the security policies and what safe conduct in the organization is. So they must be very aware of a safety procedure and practice that is expected of them once they are hired and what is considered as, for example, private information, okay, safety practice, and what can be shared or cannot be shared once they are hired as an employee in your organization. And usually, before hiring, there will be some background checks that you can perform on your future candidates. So this include the personal identity verification, perhaps their education. You want to verify whether the certificate that are given to you is perhaps genuine and authentic, and also reference check. So usually in CV or resumes, candidate will need to provide reference checks such as from their lecturer, for example, or their past manager. So please do the checking. Okay, do not just ask for reference, but you don't follow up with checking on the reference. This is very important. If you are bringing people in your organization, you want to ensure that the people that you hire is trusted. And also, as the candidate themselves, you yourself, let's say you are applying for a certain position, provide very viable and trusted reference. And then of course, the record in terms of medical history, credit history, okay, even your criminal or court history, they will be checking up on that, okay, based on whatever information that is available to them. Okay, this is very important either as future employer or even as employee that is coming to an organization. Okay, always perform the background check before hiring, and if you are a candidate, always give the needed information to ensure that the hiring become much more faster or even easier for the organization. So before you get people to enter your organization, always make sure you have a very thorough contract about what is covered, what is the candidate job role, what is the responsibility to the company, and also what is the company's responsibility towards the employee. So you must protect your employee, and also your employee must also understand his or her role in your organization. This must be reflected clearly on the hiring contract, because you don't want to have any issues later on because your employee perhaps doesn't understand what is his or her responsibility towards your organization. And also, if something happened to you as an employee, you must know your rights and what can you do about it if, let's say, you are mistreated by the organization. Always read the contract thoroughly. Sometimes also, in terms of uh, embedding security practices in the organization, you can also embed this as part of the performance evaluation. So how does your employee actually keep track of their documentation? How do they store their secret document, for example? How do they do the documentation? How do they actually perform verification? This can be a part of the practice that you instill to ensure that it can be rewarded and can be embedded as a normal practice in your organization. So what about termination? Okay, before this we have covered hiring. Now, sometimes there are termination or also resignation. Termination, of course, sometimes regarding disciplinary action or perhaps some wrongdoings in the organization performed by the employee. While resignation is perhaps the contract has ended or perhaps the term of service has already been reached for a certain employee in your company. So usually, when this employee leaves the organization, these tasks must be performed. First of all, you must remember to disable all access to the organization system. So either remotely or internally, the keys to the building, for example, the key card must be returned by the employee. So basically, return or removable media given to the employee during the course of his work. The third, the hard drive must be secured. So perhaps any password can be disabled that once was operated by the employee, or perhaps change the password and the access. And also, file cabinet and door locks must be changed. Keycard access must be revoked and returned. Personal effects must be removed, and escort the former employee from the premise. Okay, this is usually if your building has a very sensitive and private information and documentation. Okay, always make sure this termination or even resignation practice is followed to ensure the safeguard of your information asset. Also, it is very advisable to perform an exit survey to ensure that the leaving employee understand their responsibility and perhaps what they need to do before they leave the organization. And also in terms of reminding, let's say in terms of non-disclosure document or agreement, perhaps previously the employer is responsible for very private and secret documentation. So you must remind them in terms of legal obligation if let's say such information is being leaked to the outside after they are no longer the employee of the organization. And also you want to obtain certain feedback regarding what is happening and whether their living is actually on good terms or perhaps otherwise. This is very important to understand perhaps what could be the future threats and perhaps certain vulnerability that could come from the termination or resignation from the employee. And also, usually you need to understand whether whatever job that has been done by that employee has been safely transferred to his replacement that is leaving from the department. So understand whatever role before that is holding before is now is void. Okay, the most important thing is for you to understand the employee that is leaving and also the employee themselves understand what can be done after this, after his leaving from the organization. So in terms of termination issue, they can either be a friendly departure or a hostile departure. Hostile departure is most likely out of from termination, and usually sometimes the employee is not expecting for them to be terminated and has to leave the organization. So this is where you must ensure that any private documentation, any logs or any access to the building has now been revoked after the termination has occurred. While at the other side, if this departure is a friendly departure, usually okay, the employee themselves will tender a notice, or even for retiring, okay, in let's say in 6 months time the employee will be leaving. So the gradual leaving process can be done very well. So in terms of leaving the responsibility to the next in line in the organization, or perhaps handing over the document, or even handing over the key card or any access to the building can be done gradually because you have know this in advance, usually in a friendly departure situation. So always take note of these two situations. You cannot actually treat both situations the same because obviously they are not the same. So in both situations, either good or bad terms, all items, all information, all access must be inventoried and checked upon the leaving of the employee. So you must ensure that whatever files is being destroyed or they are properly audited to ensure that no future access can be given or can be used from their from the employee credentials such as the username and password, the key card, and also the keys that previously was given to the employee. So you must examine logs, okay, after the employee is leaving to ensure that they will not attempt to enter the perhaps the company firewall, for example, after they are no longer the employee of the organization. Always keep this check perhaps in 1 to 3 months time to ensure that your organization is very much safe from unauthorized access from this ex-employee. For personal security, these are some of the advice for very safe personal security practice. First of all, if you have people in your organization that has many responsibility, always have a very clear separation of duties. Means that okay, person A and person B understand what is their role in the organization, just strictly perhaps for clerical work, and then the other perhaps for that specific department. And then always have a two-man control in the organization so that one individual will not actually overpower other individuals in doing certain tasks. This can also prevent corruption because always in a task there will be more than one person that will be responsible to verify certain jobs on your department. So for example, whatever action needed to be taken by one person must be verified perhaps by the head department. And your head department perhaps must also be verified from other people in the organization. Always keep in check whatever activity that happens in your organization to ensure that there will be no room or perhaps less room for corruption of power and responsibility. Another good practice is to have job rotation and task rotation within the department or an organization. This is to ensure that all the people in the organization knows what everyone is responsible of and not one person is actually overpowering or having very strict control on certain individual or even tasks within the company. So make sure that everybody knows what everyone is doing and make sure that each people have a chance to do this task in a separate event. So for example, let's say for 1 month, person A will do task A and then person B will do task B. And then during second month, you rotate the role. Okay, person B will do task A, person A will do task B. This is to ensure that everybody knows what needs to be done in the organization. And let's say, okay, in future, if let's say person A needs to leave the company, you already have a backup from person B because the task being done from person A is or can also be done by person B. So this also ensure that your organization can safely operate without depending too much to one person for a task. Okay, a healthy work environment is where you have job rotation and task rotation. And also it's good to have a mandatory vacation to the employee to ensure that you can review their work and you can see their performance perhaps. If let's say they are not in the organization, you can thoroughly perform some interview regarding the performance of that individual. And also, another positive point, the employee can unwind and perhaps relax from a very hectic work environment. Also, it's very important to have a very good access control to your employee because not every employee needs to be given all access to the company because sometimes the thing that you need to view is limited to just a particular document or just a specific document within the responsibility of that employee. So ensure that you have a very good access control policy and even ways for employee to maneuver to get the documentation that they want. And of course, for any access within the organization resources, always good to have a very good log system so that you know or your organization know which employee has access to what is the time, and what are they accessing regarding this sensitive documentation. Because you want to be safe, let's say something happened, even without the knowledge of the employee themselves, you want to ensure that you know what is being accessed, which account is being used, because let's say that account is compromised, you want to know which account is actually being compromised. So this is very important to ensure the safety of your sensitive data within the confines of your organization. Also, not forgetting, you must ensure that your employee personal data is well protected within the confines of your organization because upon hiring individual, you will get their sensitive information such as their social security numbers, their ID, for example, their address, their spouse name, their children's name. So this very personal information must be safeguarded within the confines of your organization. Make sure your data containing this sensitive information are protected because your employee are trusting you with the information, so you must be responsible to safeguard this information. Okay, so personal data is no different than other data that information security must protect. These are also information asset that you need to protect and also consider when protecting this within your organization. You might include this in your important information asset that worth protecting and needs protecting. Apart from your own employee, sometimes your organization will also deal with non-employees. This could also include your client or perhaps contractors going in and out of the premise of your organization. This can also be your customer using your perhaps e-commerce server that wants to use your service. So this must also be considered in terms of safeguarding your organization and even safeguarding this non-employee. Types of non-employees that you should be concerned about always are the types that always has access to your office building. So such employees are temporary workers, contract employees, consultants, and business partners. This is because they are not exactly your employee, but they have some sort of business within your organization which requires them to always enter your office building, and you must ensure that the entry of the building is always supervised and being escorted by your employee. So these are some of the considerations that you can use as guideline to having non-employees within the premise of your building. First of all, always require 24 to 48 hours notice before a visit to your building. This is to ensure that you have the correct personnel to do the escorting and also reviewing and monitoring the contract or non-employee into the building. And also require all on-site personnel to undergo background checks before they actually visit your premise. You want to know that who is actually entering your building, okay, where are they from, okay, can they be trusted or not, who is vouching for them, and who is they bringing with them during the visit. And also, you also requires advance notice for cancellation and rescheduling because you don't want to give advance access to these people and you forgot to actually withdraw the access upon the cancellation. To always have proper preparation time for the visit and perhaps cancellation of visit. So basically, this chapter covers the personnel security. This includes understanding the workforce that you can include in your organization, what are the skill sets required from this individual. Other than that, we also covered the safe practice on hiring and also during the hiring and after hiring the individual in your organization. It's also good for you to take note on what can be done for non-employee entering and having business within your organization. The key here is to always have a security practice on site and embedded within the people to ensure the safeguard of your information security asset. Okay, so we end this session, and if there's any further discussion, feel free to ask me later. Thank you very much for joining.